Hi and welcome to Chapter 10. We're going to look at gendered organizational communication, and we're going to begin with gendered stereotypes in the workplace and, well, the social expectations, if you will, of the sexes influence how we treat people in professional contexts. We're going to begin with the stereotypes of women. And these are generalized, but they're categorized. So women in the workplace are often stereotyped into one of four categories. Now, we're doing this based on what we see in our textbook, and these are good research-based categories. Now, there will be other experiences I'm sure you've had that might not fit into one of these categories really neatly, and that's okay. We're just trying to do an overview of the kinds of categorization for both men and women. And the first one is what's known as the sex object. The sex object stereotype defines women's value by her sexual attractiveness, perceiving women based on their appearance rather than their qualifications. Now again, we may not all see this in our own experience, and we have to bear in mind that we're wearing, if you will, glasses that have been given to us, if you will, and shaped according to our past experience. And we may say to ourselves, well, geez, I wouldn't treat a woman by her attractiveness. Of course I would look at her qualifications. But until you're that woman in that situation, we aren't there to judge whether or not this happens based on our own perspective. We really have to aim at putting our belief system to the side and look at this as saying, this is something that relates to women, that women might be more aware of than men might. And the same will be true when we get to the male stereotypes, is that we'll hear some things that women might say, well, that doesn't make sense, or men might say, I don't believe that. We need to put our beliefs to the side and look at this objectively to say that this is research-based perspectives about what occurs for people in workplaces. And like I said, there's room for outliers and other examples, but these are just categories that generally represent the experience. So the first is sex object. Now, federal law forbids discrimination based on sex, sexual orientation, race, national origin, age, disability, religion, and some qualities are considered bona fide occupational requirements. So it's important that in Canada we have a federal law that does this. In the US it's a little different. And maybe if you've been watching news lately, you will have seen some things or heard some things in US politics recently that make you go, well, aren't there protections for that? The US has different rules and laws than the Canadians do in regards to this. This stereotyping contributes to sexual harassment of women and members of the LGBTQ communities. Now, the second particular sort of generalized stereotype is that which is known as mother. This stereotype of women as mother has figurative and literal forms. The figurative version is expressed when others expect women to take care of everyone. Will you make sure everyone has coffee? Make sure that the meeting room is all prepared and ready for all the people who come in for the meeting? Will you make sure that, so when women are treated in that sort of way, that's the figurative version of the mother role. This stereotyping also leads to segregation of female employees into positions of providing support and care for others, such as the clerical and service positions. The literal form of mother is employees who are also mothers. These women are perceived as less serious. They are less likely to be hired or promoted or are offered lower salaries, mostly because they're going to leave and have children, and therefore they aren't as valuable. Fatherhood tends to benefit male workers who are seen as being more committed to earning an income. There's a term called the maternal wall, which refers to the unexamined assumptions held by co-workers and superiors about how women will behave at work after they become mothers. Now, again, this is what's really interesting about this to me, is that it's always challenging to sort of get my head around that workplaces can be this stereotyping to women. Because I might say to myself, and I often do, these are things that I don't feel I do. And I would say, well, then maybe nobody else does. But that's when I speak to women and ask them about their experiences, they can pull out example after example of when this has affected them. And so it's quite interesting. And I do this with men on the men's stereotypes as well. The third generalized category is that of child. This stereotype sees women as child or a pet, cute, but not to be taken seriously. Women are assumed to need the protection of adults. And so this is where this sort of stereotyping comes into play, is often stereotyping women as children is justified as protecting women from the harsh realities of the world. Since when do they need protecting? One example of this is the obstacle of women serving in law enforcement, where the difficulty is how can you possibly defend when you're a woman? That's what men do, is protect you. The fourth is what's known as the Iron Maiden. Stereotyping women a woman who is ambitious, directive, competitive, and sometimes tough is what has been labeled as the Iron Maiden. A woman with these qualities as competent but unlikable because they are unfeminine. Now, and I know I've worked in places where women have been tough, direct, ambitious, the same qualities that men have in workplaces, but they get treated quite a bit differently. They get maligned for being tough. We have terms we use in that instance. So it's a compliment to call a male worker ambitious, but it's not necessarily seen as a compliment when we do that to women. So let's see what the difference is. Let's look at stereotypes of men. Men in the workplace are often stereotyped in ways that reflect cultural views of masculinity and that affect how men are perceived and treated. And we'll start with the first one. It's known as the sturdy oak. The sturdy oak is a self-sufficient pillar of strength. With this view, men may rule out consulting others in advice or assistance. They just go right ahead and they move in that direction because we see them as a sturdy oak. That means that men can't, in this particular stereotype, express vulnerabilities, weaknesses, doubt. You're looked upon as having this pillar of strength, and you will go forward and do the best for everybody without their assistance. And I've had examples of male bosses and male people in the workforce who come across as a sturdy oak, and you wonder how come you didn't get asked for your input, because it's going to affect you and other people, so why wouldn't you have been? But the sturdy oak goes forward. The second is the fighter. Men are Superman-like warriors who get into battles either literally or metaphorically. Fighters should be aggressive, win at all costs. There's no room to be less than fully committed. Men who ask for paternity leave can face hostility for not putting their career first. Men are increasingly resisting this pressure. Now, this is one of those sort of stereotypes, again, that in the fluidity of gender and feminine and masculine, we are redefining things all the time, over time. And one of the redefinitions is that we don't have to be so aggressive. We can have doubt and we can express emotionally, and that's okay. And yet, these stereotypes make it difficult for men who want to be able to be a family man and not just the babysitter of their child, but to be a co-parent. It's getting difficult with these stereotypes. The third is breadwinner. Now, this one comes through quite a lot more from historic perspectives, but it still comes through. It's one of the strongest stereotypes of men, and that is of the breadwinner. It is the reason they are often paid more than women, but also why they are expected to put work ahead of family time. Is that you're the breadwinner, you support the family, your job is to make sure that there's enough revenue brought into the family that the family can be successful and protected by the breadwinner. But that doesn't always ring true, does it? What if you have dual incomes, where you have both mom and dad raising children and making money? What if she makes more money than he does? And that's starting to happen more frequently. So these locked-in stereotypes for men and women are difficult in that they lock people into things that maybe aren't genuine or real for the time and place. Men who tie their identity and worth to earning power are in danger in a culture where gender roles are evolving. Non-binary, if we look at the stereotypes as it relates to the non-binary gender in organizations, the lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans workers are often met with hostility for challenging gender in the workplace, and they may have fewer legal protections. Now that fits more to the U.S. Canada has, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms to use as a foundation for legal protections. It doesn't mean that LGBT, Q individuals won't still need to do that, maybe more so than others, but there is a protection built in that allows there to be a foundation to work from. Performing non-binary gender, like wearing something outside the norm, can risk hostility by colleagues, eligibility for promotion, and the job itself. There is no consistent federal protection for sexual orientation and gender identity and expression. Now, again, that's one of the differences between U.S. and Canada. It might be less so in U.S., but it is stronger in Canada for that protection. Now, narrow gender stereotypes that limit potential for all workers. So the masculine norms in professional life, because men have historically dominated institutional life, from stockyards back in the day and factories to corporations, masculine norms in professional life are infused in the workplace. Because historically, we have been predominantly male-driven in the workforce. It's only in the last, maybe beginning in the 60s through the 70s, 80s, and now where we see more balance occurring, where women are started entering the workplace, not just in the clerical and service areas where it's predominantly female, but in what would be considered traditional masculine workplaces where the masculine norms are in place. Traditional masculine images of leaders, the communication skills developed in masculine speech communities are often associated with management and leadership skills. There isn't seemingly room for the feminine speech communities in leadership and in management. They seem to be contradictory. These skills include assertiveness, independence, competitiveness, and confidence. Now, of course, we know those all apply to women. But when you're moving into a workplace where it's been predominantly based on male images of norms and male speech communities, then this is where those stereotypes started to come in. If you have a woman coming into a male work environment predominantly where the male speech community, and she's assertive, independent, competitive, and confident, how do you think she would be viewed by the men in that workforce? Now, there will be many who will say, great, we need that. And there are going to be many who are going to call that person, that woman, the Iron Maiden. Maybe not in terms like that, but in the way they treat her. She's not behaving as a woman. She's trying to behave like a man, and that doesn't suit us. It's quite the challenge in this new era of gender fluidity. There are some gender differences in how individuals approach work. This includes leadership. Men tend to find having authority intrinsically rewarding, whereas feminine communicators should become proficient complying with masculine norms, and masculine communicators should develop skills in collaboration and support. Now, I've used the word should quite a bit, and it's what should happen. The reality is, does it happen? And it may happen in many more workplaces today than even 20 years ago, and maybe many more again in 20 years from now. In fact, the most effective leadership styles are those that blend relationship building with instrumental qualities. Now, if you remember, instrumental qualities are usually the to-do, things that need to get done. These are the tasks. So effective leadership styles involve delegation, sharing responsibility, that's the instrumental task, and relationship building. Making sure everybody's okay, making sure that you get what you need to complete the tasks that you've been assigned. Now, traditional masculine norms for career paths, well, we tend to think of career as linear. All right? That's that we start at an entry position or work our way up the ladder. We also think of them as being full-time jobs. When we think about men getting jobs, we think in terms of full-time. Remember, breadwinners. This assumption reflects the social relations of previous eras, and that's partly the point, is that some of this masculine norms are based on 30, 40, 50 years ago. Not where we necessarily are today, but these internal cultures of how we treat one another have to catch up. Workers often want organizations to have more flexible schedules and policies to accommodate family and life choices that are consistent with, that are not necessarily consistent with full-time life. Job share, different lengths of workday. Maybe instead of working in the morning, I work afternoon and evening, or I work every other Saturday and I don't work on Monday and Tuesday. These sort of flexibility and choices that balance work life, family life, and social life. Linear models such as the non-linear model, such as flexible hours, on-site child care, part-time work, and more flexible overall career paths. There shouldn't just be one trajectory. Recent research shows that women who work outside of the home are as happy and healthy than stay-at-home mothers, and among single mothers, more so. Children of working mothers are just as advanced academically, emotionally balanced, and socially adjusted as those that stay-at-home mothers. Now, that's research-based. A lot of our belief that children are going to be worse off when mothers work is belief based on what? Oftentimes it's based on just how I've been told by other people who are just as ill-informed. We don't go and do critical thinking about what is real and what is not, what is the perspective and what is really not. When mothers who have paid work leave to care for children attempt to return, there are often obstacles into the return. Now, in Canada, that's less so. There are protections in place. Better protections, not universal and always going to work out, but there are models by which to do that. So if we move into the gendered patterns of organizations, we can see that there are formal and informal. And we're going to begin with formal practices. And we'll start with the leave policies for leave of work. The Family and Medical Leave Act, that's the FMLA, that's in the United States, that empowers employees, that states that employees can take up to 12 weeks unpaid leave to care for new babies or sick family members. In 2010, this was extended to workers in the same-sex relationships who needed time to care for a partner's child. However, the FMLA covers only about 60% of employees in the United States. Some states have enacted more generous family leave laws. Since the FMLA does not require that employers pay employees on leave, many workers can't afford to take that leave. Now, the United States is the only high-income country in the world, and one of very few countries in general that does not provide a guaranteed paid family leave or policy. The United States shares this distinction with Oman, Papua New Guinea, and Tonga. I'm not sure that's something to be so proud of. In Canada, we have employment insurance, maternity benefits that can be paid for a maximum period of 15 weeks. You cannot receive EI maternity benefits beyond 17 weeks after the expected or actual week of childbirth, whichever of the two is later. EI maternity benefits are payable only to the biological mother who is unable to work because she is pregnant and has recently given birth. To receive maternity benefits, you need to prove your pregnancy by signing a statement declaring the expected due date or the actual date of birth. Now, also, EI parental benefits can be paid for a maximum of 35 weeks. The payments must be made within 52 weeks of the week of your child was born or the week your child was placed with you for adoption. So there's better overall supports in Canada. The EI parental benefits are payable only to the biological or adoptive parents while they are caring for the newborn or newly adopted child. To receive parental benefits, you must sign a statement declaring the newborn's date of birth or when is the adoption of the child's date placement for the purposes of adoption and the name of and the address of the adoption authority. There are checks and balances, and that's important, but there is more support for families in Canada. Now, if we look at work schedules are part of this formal policies. The rigid work schedules are another reflection of outdated career models. This model doesn't accommodate two-worker or single-parent families with young children. Women are more likely than men to take off work in order to provide care for children. Providing more leave time and flexible working hours can actually save employers money by boosting worker productivity, increasing worker morale, and reducing turnover. A nursing home in Sweden reduced work hours without reducing pay and saw an increase in productivity. Now, those are the only two formal components we're going to look at. We're going to begin to look at informal practices. Now, informal practices are different than formal. Formal are written down and you can look at them and review and see what it says, and that's what's going to happen. Informal practices are rarely written down, and these are usually word of mouth or just the way we do things. Unwelcoming environments for women, even when that's one informal policy. You won't see it written anywhere that we must not treat women the same in our work environment. You will see it written contrary to that, but the informal will include an unwelcoming environment for women. Even when used unintentionally, language relating to sports, sexuality, and the military may bind men into a masculine community in which some women feel unwelcome. Now, you can check out the examples in your textbook for that one. Now, there's also within many workplaces an informal network. Informal networks, or it's also known in some workplaces, and you might have heard the term, an old boys network, are comprised of predominantly male members. They hire and promotion decisions are often made through this informal communication within these networks where they tend to hire other males. Informal networks are made up of people who see themselves as similar, which can create barriers for co-workers who are not like most of the people in the group. Women, people of color, and gender non-conforming workers may avoid informal networks and lose out on key sources of information and support. And that, as much as it's not written down, it may be happening informally. And so if you were to complain, sometimes the complaint goes to the administration and they look at the policy and say, well, the policy says that we don't support this. And they'll try maybe to correct things and maybe some words will be expressed, but there's nothing in what was done that fits within the formal. It was done and it's one person's word versus the other. A third area in informal is mentoring relationships. Now, a mentor is an experienced person who helps guide the development of a less experienced person. Women and minorities are less likely to have mentors than white men. And now, again, this is predominantly a U.S.-based content, but it's not exclusive. Reasons for the lower number of mentors for minorities and women, they conclude that fewer women and minorities work in senior positions, which results in less opportunity for new female and minority employees to be mentored. Men are sometimes reluctant to mentor young women for fear of gossip about sexual relations. They may assume women are less serious about their careers, or that they feel they're less comfortable with women than men. And so this brings up this sort of historic view of who women are. Are they children to be protected? Well, we can't, are they sexual objects? These are built in as part of the informal structure that some of these stereotypes do play out. Some women have formed their own networks to compensate and to provide women with support and a sense of belonging with other professions. You find women's networks. Another challenge is workplace bullying, which is repeatedly acted towards another person in a way that humiliates, intimidates, or undermines that person's credibility. And women and gender nonconforming workers are more frequently targets of bullying by both men and other women. Men bully men and women equally. Now, that's not something to be proud of. I'm glad there's equality, but that's still part of the environment, that there are informal structures where men tend to do that more. Now, women tend to more frequently bully other women. Now, this possibly could explain by early socialization of girls to evaluate and critique other girls. Now, we did that in, I've forgotten which chapter it was, just a couple of weeks ago. Now, there's a couple of terms you may have heard before. One is the glass ceiling and the other is the glass walls. The glass ceiling is the invisible barrier that limits advancements for women. They can't get up because there's a glass ceiling that stops. The most often results from subtle discrimination. It's not written in our formal policies, but it seems women don't get promoted as frequently as men. The term glass walls is a metaphor for sex segregation on jobs, which means women placed in positions that require traditionally feminine skills, assistance, clerical, counseling, human relations. If you go to any organization and look at their structure and look at human resources, payroll, service, clerical, you'll find those are predominantly women. These jobs typically do not include opportunities for advancements. If you go to your grocery store and canvass every store, any box store, and see how many of the cashiers are men, they are predominantly women, and that's what they mean by glass walls. There isn't places for them to be in more senior and management sort of circumstances. So now let's look at some efforts to readdress gender inequality in institutions. Now, this is a predominantly U.S.-based selection, and some of this occurs in Canada and some of it is more successful in Canada, but it's also not complete. So let's just look at this. One, we're going to look at equal opportunity laws. Now, in the U.S., there's two main equal opportunities laws that were passed since Brown, and this is Title VII of the Civil Liberties Act of 1964, which prohibits discrimination in employment. Interesting that it hasn't been updated since 1964. And Title IX, which we talked about in the Gendered Education chapter. This was done in 1972, which forbids discrimination in education programs that receive federal aid. Now, several other equal opportunity laws have been passed as well. The most recent one was the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Play Act of 2009. Equal opportunity laws focus on discrimination against individuals, not discrimination against groups. Complaints must claim a particular person has suffered a discrimination and focus on present practices. The recent EEOC rulings have extended protections against sex discrimination to workers based on gender identity and sexual orientation, but these protections vary from state to state. Affirmative action grew from the need to address the weight of historical prejudice. It was based on three key ideas. Historical patterns of discrimination have affected groups of people, so remedies must apply to groups, not just individuals. 2, to compensate for a legacy of discrimination, there must be preferential treatment to qualified members of groups that have suffered discrimination. And 3, effectiveness of remedies is judged by results, not just the intent. Now, the affirmative action has two important limitations, too. Affirmative action recognizes the limited ability to qualified people from historically underrepresented groups. Fewer women and minorities have the education and experience to be qualified. Now, that is certainly in Canada changing dramatically. Affirmative action does not encourage admitting, hiring, or promoting women and minorities that are not qualified. Qualified means the applicant meets requirements, but they are not necessarily the best qualified, and that's an important distinction. We'll look also at quotas. Now, we've heard this term, and it has applied in Canada, but it's more so in the United States. A quota specifies a number or a percentage of some group that must be admitted, hired, or promoted. This can mean if there are not enough qualified people to meet the quota, unqualified people must be promoted. We can look also at what goals. Now, goals are funny, but we'll go with this one. Goals consist of an institution's stated intention to achieve representation of minorities or women. There are no penalties for failing to meet the goal. Goals and quotas may work against women and minorities because there's no expectation that if you set a goal that you can actually need to achieve it. And then quotas and goals, they're seen as a maximum rather than a minimum number of women or minorities who will be admitted, hired, or promoted. Now, other institutional members may assume they only got in because of their sex or their race, and thus women and minorities may be perceived as underqualified when they're not. And lastly, we look at diversity training. Diversity training aims to increase awareness of and respect for differences that arise from distinct standpoints. It is often implemented in combination with one of the other above listed, goals, affirmative action, and the first one. A limitation of diversity training is that it requires strong personal commitment from the participants. Many people are unwilling to make changes, especially those that will reduce what they think is their own privilege. So part of the problem with diversity training is the person who receives it isn't always committed to doing any better or wanting to learn because they may not think they did anything inappropriate. So it can be a problem. I hope this has been helpful. That's the end of gendered organizational communication, and we've got 2 weeks to go. So keep up the good work, stay the course, and finish to the end. Bye now.